Hi, Anant.
Hi, Bob.
How,
It's good to be with you.
good to be with you. How you doing there?
I'm doing very well. We are at the tail end of our semester, so it's a little bit of a hectic time, and both professor and students are lower on energy than at the beginning.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available both via streaming video and via audio podcast download. You have the euphonious name Anantanand Rambachan, or is it Rambachan?
Rambachan.
So it's Anantanand Rambachan, which sounds like a poem in itself, almost. It's a beautiful name. To save time, I'm going to use your nickname, Anant.
That's
Uh, you are a professor of religion at St. Olaf College in Minnesota, right?
that's correct, Bob.
And you're author of the Advaita Worldview, but more to the point, you're author of the book we're going to talk about, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, which has a lot of interesting dimensions. First of all, there's just the phenomenon of liberation theology, which arose in a Christian context, specifically a Catholic context, and is very much not just a theological movement, but a political movement, you could say, and has been a very important force in Catholicism to this day. Uh, so we're going to talk about that, what theology liberation means, but then you are developing a specifically Hindu version of that, which is interesting because it'll bring us in touch with Hinduism. And then there's this subtitle that may strike some as cryptic, but we'll explain what it means. It says, "Not two is not one," and that refers in part to the specific school of Hindu thought that you associate with, Advaita Vedanta. And I think that'll be of interest to some of our listeners because it actually has some deep connections with Buddhist philosophy that may be familiar. I mean, the Buddhist philosophy is probably more familiar to a lot of our listeners
Yes.
than Hindu philosophy, but they have more in common than people realize, and I think Advaita Vedanta in particular
Yes. Yes.
highlights that. And you're developing this theology of liberation very much in the context of Advaita Vedanta. So we'll get to what
Yes.
that means. Why don't we start out with what liberation theology means? What does that mean to you, kind of generically?
So, thank you, Bob, for this conversation. I think that for me, liberation theology is an approach to describing the meaning of the religious life, in which liberation is understood not only as freedom from suffering in a future life or a future state of being, but centrally with freedom from suffering in this life. So it expands also, first of all, is concerned centrally with the quality of our lives here and now. And I would say also that it expands the meaning of suffering to include poverty,
Mm-hmm.
injustice, powerlessness. Liberation theology has a special concern with what we speak of, or what the tradition speaks of as systemic injustice. And that is the injustice or the suffering that human beings inflict upon each other through unjust social, economic, uh, political structures. And so freedom from suffering from such structures can only be attained by the transformation of structures of society.
Okay, right. And liberation theology arose particularly in the context of, I guess, Latin American Catholicism and was very much an attempt to move the interests of poor people in that region more to the forefront of Christian concern, I guess you could say. You know, in a context where there was a tremendous amount of material inequality and poverty and so on. So that part, certainly of the original liberation theology, you would very much identify with, and I gather, and that's very much that spirit is one thing you're trying to place in a Hindu context now.
Well, right. I am inspired by the liberation theology movement in the Christian church, and you quite rightly describe its origins. The attempt to develop a theology that speaks to human suffering in its corporeal, materiality. And along with that, you mentioned as well the Buddhist tradition, I know you're familiar with the engaged Buddhist movement, and that's also one of the sources of my inspiration and learning. So I would say, Bob, that the encounter with these strands of thinking in these traditions prompted me to look deeply into my own tradition and to see how I can retrieve resources to construct a liberation theology in the Hindu tradition.
Okay, sounds good. And we should say there have been various, you might say, more specific applications of liberal theology since it arose. I mean, one example is Black liberation theology.
Yes.
As you know, a person who's, I think, typically identified as kind of the father of or the founder of Black liberation theology is here at Union Theological Seminary, James Cone, where I'm now visiting professor of science and religion. I know you were here recently and met with him. So let's start at the beginning and talk a little about Advaita Vedanta. So
Yes.
I gather, I mean, there's two words there. Vedanta kind of refers to the part of ancient Hindu literature that is drawn on in particular, right? It means literally means the end of the Vedas, and I guess specifically referring to the Upanishads, right, which are the philosophical and I guess theological texts that come later in the whole Vedantic history,
Yes.
right? And then Advaita is a word that means non-dual, right?
Right.
So why don't you explain to us, and we should say, Vedanta is one school of emphasis within Hinduism, and then within Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta is more specific still, but it has a certain kind of prominence now because I would say it is, and this is perhaps because it's particularly well suited to a modern philosophical era, but in any event, it is. It's probably the form of Hinduism that people in kind of Western circles are particularly likely to encounter these days, I think.
Yes. I think you already give a very nice summary. So let me go back a little bit and develop in a little more detail what you said, Bob. So there are two words, Advaita Vedanta. And like you, I'll start with the word Vedanta, which literally means the end of the Vedas. So in the Hindu tradition, we have the four Vedas that are recognized as authoritative sources of teaching. And at the end of the Vedas, we have these dialogues, philosophical, religious dialogues that are also called collectively as the Upanishads. So Vedanta, broadly speaking, refers to the teachings of the Upanishads that are found at the end of the Vedas. And these are the collections of dialogues. They are thought of as the wisdom section of the Vedas. The first part of the Vedas deal a lot with matters of worship and ritual, but it is at the end of the text that we get the engagement with the fundamental questions of human existence, the reality of death, of suffering, of liberation, and so on. So we have the word Vedanta refers to the end of the Vedas, but it also refers to any philosophical or theological tradition that is based on the teachings of the Vedas. And as you said, there are several traditions of Vedanta based on different interpretations of the meaning of these dialogues. And then the word that precedes Vedanta, Advaita, identifies, therefore, the specific character of the interpretation, the specific theological assertion. So in this case, the tradition that I work out of is the Advaita Vedanta tradition. So the word Advaita gives you a profound clue to what this tradition is all about. And the word, as in the title of my book, literally means not two. Not two. So it characterizes the relationship between what we regard as ultimate reality and the world, not as one, which would be a sort of pantheism, and not two, which is be a dualism. So it is neither one nor two, but not two. Basically, it affirms an ontological unity in reality. That ultimate reality is spoken of in the Upanishads as Brahman, the infinite, constitutes the true being, the ultimate selfhood of the human person and the world. That is what is at the very heart of the Advaita claim.
Right.
A fundamental unity of existence, an ontological singularity.
In other words, that there ultimately is that any seeming distinction between me and ultimate reality, Brahman, which is defined various ways. You can see it defined as a kind of a world, a universal soul, or ultimate reality, or divinity in some relatively abstract metaphysical sense. But anyway, the idea is that of Advaita, of non-dual, not two, is that the seeming distinction between me and that wondrous sounding thing, Brahman, is illusory, right? Now, let me stop before I can see you're approaching your answer with some hesitation. I think you're about to kind of correct me. And one thing I want to say is what's interesting about your book is that there are interpretations of Advaita that you're very concerned about because you think, well, I guess because you think they're wrong, but also because you think they lead to an inappropriate view of what our role in this world is. And this is very much, and you think the interpretation of Advaita that you want leads to this liberation theology and leads to engagement with the needs of the poor and with various oppressed groups. I mean, you get into patriarchy and homophobia and the caste system in India in your book. And so this, what you're about to do here, which is clarify exactly your interpretation of Advaita, is fundamental to your argument because it's the interpretation that you think leads us to an appropriate approach to engagement with the world. Now, let me back up and say one more thing. I think, isn't it true, this whole thing that you're going to unpack and interpret, this non-dual concept, doesn't it come down to a very famous quotation from the Upanishads, which is translated as "Thou art that," or "That art thou," or "You are that," or "That is you," and that is about the relationship between Atman, the self, the individual soul, whatever you want to call it, and this Brahman thing, right? There's a single quote in the Upanishads that is the foundation of Advaita. It's I guess in a dialogue. And I guess a father says to his son or something, explaining to him that you, the Atman, and the Brahman, well, it's interpreted, one interpretation is, you're the same thing, don't you get it? That art thou, you are that, okay? So that's, now with my having consumed all that valuable time trying to set the context, let me let you spend a lot of time explaining what you think is the right and the wrong way to look at this.
Okay, so excellent, Bob. I can build on exactly the points that you highlighted. So one of the important concerns of Advaita is that while it proposes that ultimate reality is single, There's a single ontological reality that existed before the coming into being of the many.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big challenges of the Advaita tradition is how to describe the relationship between the one and the many. Now, some interpreters have gone in the direction of describing the many as illusory, and they have many analogies that they use, analogies of sense illusions and perceptual errors to describe the many.
So in this view, the world we see is an illusion. It's like the Matrix in the movie The Matrix.
Yes,
Or something.
yes. Now, as you rightly hinted, I don't affirm that kind of interpretation. Because why? I think at the heart of the Advaita tradition is, in fact, the claim that everything is Brahman. And the analogies that I draw from the text, so the analogy that I go to would be one that comes out of the Upanishads, the Chandogya Upanishad, that uses the analogy of clay, and of course it's only an analogy, and many pots that are made out of clay. So you have many shapes, many forms, but you have one reality, clay, that assumes these many forms, rich, distinctive forms, but the clay is not exhausted by its expression in these multiple forms. But I will not describe the forms as illusory. Right? I hesitate to describe it because for many reasons. One of the simple reasons is that, Bob, is that when we describe something as an illusion, if we see that which is true, the illusion vanishes. But in the case of the universe, we can't make it go away. Mm-hmm. Right? So when we look at a clay pot, we can see its distinctive qualities, but we should also see its truth, which is clay. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing that I will say. The Advaita, there's a very famous teaching in the Upanishads that everything is Brahman. In Sanskrit, we say, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahman. Everything is Brahman, but that doesn't mean that the manyness that we experience is properly described as having an illusory status. I think for me, it's better to describe the many as expressions of the one, a celebration of the one. Mm-hmm. It's a celebration, it's a divine outburst of celebration that finds expression in an astonishing variety of names and forms. The one, becoming many without losing its infinitude. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point I would like to say. And the reason why I say that, and you have hinted that already, I think that I'm being faithful to a reading of the text. And secondly, I think the interpretation of the world as an illusion, and you hinted at this, also leads to a certain attitude to the world. And the attitude that I find problematic is the one that does not take the problems of the world, and especially the problems of injustice, as serious as it ought to be taken. It minimizes and sometimes even trivializes injustice and oppression and suffering. Mm-hmm. But if I can say one more thing, because I just want to complete the points that you made. And yes, you're quite right. You were speaking, the fundamental sentence that you were mentioning is that thou art, mm-hmm. which is a translation of the Sanskrit Tat Tvamasi. So this is a teaching that comes across in a conversation between a father and his son. And basically, what the father was trying to help his son appreciate, because we think of ourselves as disconnected. We think of ourselves and we think of the various elements in our universe as disconnected and existing separately and in isolation from each other. And so he was trying to get his son through this crisp statement to appreciate his or her unity with that which is ultimate. and not to think of himself as a discrete or individual separate from the totality and from the whole, by saying, this is what you truly are.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you were to tell the clay pot that it is the clay that is what you really are, or you are to tell a wave in the ocean that is water. That thou art.
Mm-hmm.
You are the water. You are the clay, expressing in this particular form. But you should also be aware of your unity with everything else.
Mm-hmm. So, the interpretation you don't want of non-dualism is kind of Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Where he says, really the truth is the ultimate thing is the light out there in the cave, and we can't even see that. All we can see is these shadows on the cave, and they're just kind of an illusion. Or equally, you would not like the interpretation of the Matrix where they just say, look, the underlying stuff is a computer code. This is just all an illusion. But because after all, one might equally well say, well, what do you mean illusion? This is a necessary projection of the code, and it's where a lot of actual meaning is, right? This is real. We have real feelings. We whatever you want to say about the world we're perceiving, it's not without meaning just because it is a projection of something deeper, right?
Yes, yes. I agree with you fully, and for many reasons. One is that, that which is ultimately real and true and has multiplied itself in this splendid variety is present intimately in the variety. It's not, there's no spatial or temporal separation between the one and the many. The one is intimately present in the many, and the many is expressing the nature of that one.
Right. So we are manifestations of it and not just fabrications of it. To be a manifestation of something is to, in a certain sense, be an extension of it, a part of it.
And to share its nature, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is, we could go a lot of places from here. It's interesting that there is this interpretation that you're concerned about, because it wouldn't have been my first guess. And in other words, the interpretation of the thou art that, or of non-dualism, as being a kind of a discounting of the suffering of others and so on. This thing you're concerned about.
Yes.
I wouldn't have thought of that as a natural interpretation, I guess, because the route I would have gone, and I guess this is more the route you'd like to go, is like, well, if the bounds in a certain sense of myself are illusory, and the bounds of you are in a sense illusory, then you and I are, and all human beings are part of the same thing. And so there's a natural organic kind of brotherhood, right? That's where I just, with my limited understanding of this, might have gone. And that may be because, in a way, I think I backed into contact with Advaita via Buddhism or something, and via meditative experience. But is it the case that really the more conventional Hindu reading had been to kind of discount the significance of perceived reality? And is the interpretation you would like to push more closer to the other one, that in a way this points to a fundamental unity of humankind if we're all manifestations of the same thing?
Yes, I want to emphasize the fundamental, I think this is at the very heart of the Advaita tradition, the fundamental unity of all humanity, and I think the fundamental unity of all existence. So I think, unfortunately for me, and as you said, you problematize it and you're asking, why did the tradition go in the direction of in some ways downplaying the significance of the many and not affirming its significance as expressions of the one? Strangely, Bob, what I found is that in certain significant interpretations of this non-dualism, we ended up with a kind of dualism.
Right.
In the sense that it ended up in a world rejection dualism without denying the ultimate unity. Somehow the expressions of this one, the many expressions of this one were devalued. And with the devaluation of the many, you ended up in an assertion that in order to affirm the one, you had to turn away from the many. You had to reject the many.
Right.
So the way you affirm the one is by turning away from the many, by world rejection rather than world affirmation. Now, this may not surprise you, but many of these interpretations were advocated among ascetics, among those who renunciants in the tradition, and so on. But I think that there is an alternative way of looking at the text. For example, you mentioned the father teaching the son, this very important truth. Now, this was a discussion that was ongoing in a domestic setting. He was not asking his son to give up, cease to be his son or to leave his family. We have examples in the Upanishads of conversations between husbands and wives. So I think that there is also a word affirming context in which these teachings can be seen. Mm-hmm. And what is important is not rejecting the world, but affirming its meaning that comes through its unity with Brahman. And I think that this leads to a different understanding of ethical responsibilities. Now, so when I say, for example, as you just said, that you see this teaching as affirming a fundamental unity of all humanity, then it leads me to an ethical responsibility, a shared ethical responsibility for each other.
Mm-hmm. So this does very much get at the subtitle that I initially said would strike people as cryptic, perhaps. Not two is not one. Yes. You're not so opposed to thinking of one in the sense of we are all one. I mean, and that to me might have been the more intuitive extension of not two of Advaita, of non-dualism. But you're concerned about the idea that ultimate reality is the only thing of significance, and the kind of perceived manifold phenomenal world is not even in the picture of significance in a certain sense, right? I mean, is that one way to put what you mean by not two is not one? We shouldn't think that only this unseen ultimate reality matters, that it's the only thing.
Well, my subtitle is a kind of a teaser in this sense. So the word Advaita literally means not two.
Right.
And but it has often been interpreted as meaning one. And when it's interpreted as meaning one, it led to a minimalization of the significance of the many. Mm-hmm. In other words, you had the interpretation that in order to affirm the value and the worth of the one, you had to dismiss the many. Mm-hmm. So in saying that not two is not one, I'm trying to question that. I'm critiquing mm-hmm. that position that devalues the many in order to affirm the one. And I'm saying basically, Bob, is that the many gain value from the fact that they express the one. They're not to be seen as opposed or contesting or excluding each other. Mm-hmm. This non-dual tradition is a tradition that can affirm the many. The one doesn't lose its significance if we affirm the many, and the many gain in significance by being seen as an expression of this one.
Okay. Well, let me elaborate a little on the Buddhist connection I alluded to, yes. Which is that, in Buddhist meditation, yes. and I think maybe much the same apprehension can occur in other forms of meditation, but in some forms of Buddhist meditation, there can be an experience where the bounds of the self start to seem permeable or even illusory, and there's a sense that actually it's all continuous, and that this idea that I stop here at the edge of my skin is illusory. And I've actually occasionally had brushes with that perception at meditation retreats, but there are people who have felt it, I think, in a much more thoroughgoing and a profound and even transformative way. And it's funny that, and by the way, generally the ethical take home of that is not to harm other beings.
Yes, compassion.
One way or another. But what's interesting is that a doctrinal issue does arise. If you start talking about this in some Buddhist circles, you have to be very careful how you talk about it. Because if you talk about it in certain ways, some people will say, no, that's Advaita Vedanta. And and here's the distinction. It's like if you say, so we are all one. So I and you, we are one. There's unity. Some people, at least in Buddhism, will say, no, you don't understand. In Buddhism, the idea is that the self does not exist to begin with. So it's misleading to describe it as unity. And then, as you know, they'll get into the doctrine of sunyata or emptiness. It's more in some sense well, I don't want to go there. I don't want to get into all the complicated stuff. But the point is, if you describe it as unity between me and all other humans, some Buddhists will say, no, that's Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's the reason, because I had encountered these very arguments, I think that's the reason that I now thought that, well, I assume the conventional interpretation of Advaita in a Hindu context is we are all one and we should be concerned about other people as much as we're concerned about ourselves, and so on. So that's kind of where my question was coming from. But one thing I want to ask you is it the case that in Hindu tradition, kind of as in Buddhism, there is a kind of contemplative experience, a kind of meditative experience that is associated with Advaita? In other words, there are people who say, I have apprehended the truth of non-dualism meditatively. It's not just an abstract philosophical doctrine, it's something I felt.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, again, let me respond to the two issues that you're raising right now. So, the relationship, as you rightly articulated it, that there are many Buddhists, and I respect this deeply, who are apprehensive about casting, this tradition of Buddhism as a form of Advaita for various reasons. I think it is an area above where we can really have very rich dialogue, because the way in which I see the dialogue occurring is in the way in which Buddhists speak about the relationship between emptiness that you just spoke of, shunyata, and form. So, in certain traditions of Buddhism, you have the discourse that everything, the ultimate nature of everything is shunyata. Mm-hmm. And this shunyata, which is, of course, transcends all language and all concepts and all definitions, it expresses itself in a multitude of forms. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, that kind of dialogue and discourse. So I see something very similar, not identical, but very similar. And this is what I'm saying. And it will be a very interesting area for dialogue between how Advaitins speak of the relationship between the one and the many, the Brahman and the many. Because Brahman also transcends all words, all concepts. It is also empty of any particular quality or characteristic. It can, in other words, in my understanding of Advaita, Brahman can become everything because Brahman is no particular thing. And many Buddhists will say, that emptiness is no particular thing. And in this way, emptiness can also express itself in everything. So I think that there is a rich area there for discussion. These two traditions can enrich, and I've been trying to engage some of my Buddhist friends in dialogue on this. I find that the way in which a Buddhist scholar like Paul Knitter writes about Buddhism enables me to engage in deep dialogue with the Advaita tradition, because I think he articulates his understanding of Buddhism in ways that I can recognize the Advaita tradition. Now, the second point is, Bob, is that in the Advaita tradition, there is a very deep relationship between teaching and practice, and the practice of contemplation and meditation. And therefore, the Advaita tradition also culminates in a certain way of being, a certain inward way of being, that in which teaching and experience mutually nourish each other, mutually clarify each other. So we are to analyze our experiences, and we are to develop states of mind that are faithful to who we are. And so I see that mutually nourishing and supportive relationship between teaching and practice, or teaching and contemplation, in the Advaita tradition.
Okay. And, I think one reason there's a certain sensitivity about this in Buddhist circles is, well, let me say two things. One is that I think I've heard a number of people, Buddhists and Buddhist scholars say, emptiness is not a fully satisfactory translation of that concept of sunyata, and is in some ways misleading. And the doctrine of emptiness is largely actually about the interdependence of things. The fact that, if you start saying, well, the tree ends here, well, actually a tree can't live without stuff that is always coming into the tree and the tree expelling things. So there's actually an interdependence among everything. That means that nothing exists kind of self-sufficiently. But the other thing I'd say is I think one reason some Buddhists are a little sensitive about sounding like they're talking about nothing more than Advaita, and they're so insistent on emphasizing that, look, we can't talk about yourself and that self as being the same thing because the self doesn't exist, is because the thing, Buddhism arose in a Hindu context. The Buddha grew up in a Hindu context, and the key distinguishing thing philosophically that he is said to have brought is this idea that the self, or soul, whatever you want to call it, Atman, does not exist. So it's like if you take that away from Buddhism, then you're basically back at Hinduism. So in a way, it's a really fundamental distinguishing doctrine for Buddhism, the idea that the self doesn't exist. But beyond that, I've been struck by how much the two actually do have in common, Hindu philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about some of that, because in the book you do get into questions that are addressed in Buddhism famously. What is the source of suffering? How do we end suffering? In other words, what does it mean to find liberation? And you spend some time early in the book on suffering and liberation. So why don't you talk a little about, and of course I think suffering is a subject of interest to all of us who suffer. Yes. And so why don't you talk a little about what causes suffering in your view, and then we'll get at maybe what distinguishes your view from other views, either within Hinduism or from the Buddhist view.
Good question, Bob, and I think I do appreciate you're taking note of the fact that that Buddhism, at that time it was not Buddhism, and Hinduism at that time was not Hinduism, but these traditions were existing, in a common geographical space, and also drawing from concepts that even today both of them share. And I think when you ask how do we account for suffering in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, I will go to the place where the Buddha, in so many ways, will go and identify what my tradition and many Buddhist traditions speak of as ignorance, or avidya.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a common discourse here, because the Buddhists will say that, the most fundamental cause of suffering, of human suffering, of our fears, of our anxieties, is in a false understanding, avidya, false understanding of the nature of reality, of the way things really are. And that includes, our understanding of ourselves. I mean, one small aside, but time does not permit us to get into all of this, but again, another fascinating area of discussion is that Advaita Vedanta also problematizes the individual selfhood, because the Buddha is also critiquing the idea of a separate individual self. And that is also problematized. In Sanskrit, it is distinguished from the ultimate self, which is the self that is, shared by all that exists. So the individual self, which is false and not true self, in Sanskrit is called ahankara. And then true self is Atman. So of course you can't even have a false self without the true self. And even the language of selfhood, I would say, Shankara also said, and interestingly, in one of he's a great commentator, Advaita commentator. He says that, the language of self is problematic for talking about Brahman. Because, when we speak of self, immediately we think individual, separate, distinctive from every other self. And that would be a deep problem in Advaita as well, just as it is in Buddhism.
So just as an aside, would this distinction between the kind of false self, the seeming self, and the true self be a little like in Christianity saying, the you that you see here is not, the ultimate self is the soul. They would say in Christianity, I think, or some Christians would say that, and the kind of material you here is it's a reflection of that or something, but it's flawed in some ways and so on. Is there any similarity?
Well, I think that, again, and even though they're not at all suggesting that the understanding is identical in all of these traditions, but the distinction between false self and true self is an interesting sort of a shared structure that many traditions do talk about. And it gets really interesting when you try to unpack, as you suggesting, what exactly is false self, what is true self, how do these two relate. But yes, so I would say that Advaita shares with the Buddhist tradition an understanding that a false understanding of what is, of reality, is at the heart of human suffering. Now, it is also true, I would readily say, that the Advaita tradition is much, following the Upanishads, is much, perhaps leans much more to a more positive way of speaking about this true being, by describing it as joy, as fullness. You do find, the Buddhist language is more apophatic when it comes to talking about, ultimate reality. There's a lot of apophatic language also in Advaita, but I think it's also complemented by a more positive way of speaking about it without necessarily limiting it.
Okay. So then one thing in common between Buddhism and certainly your tradition within Hinduism is the idea that suffering arises from ignorance, or sometimes that word that's translated as ignorance is translated as delusion, but certainly some kind of confused apprehension of the world.
Wrong apprehension of reality.
Yeah, which in Buddhism is said to be very closely tied to the what you could call thirst, or sometimes called greed, but I think misleadingly, because it isn't just material. It isn't just like a quest for money, but it's more deeply. It's like the thirst, desire in a particularly kind of headlong, heedless way, I guess. And is that something that the two have in common?
Again, really interesting Bob, I think you're opening up a whole world of dialogue here. It is fascinating. The Upanishads repeatedly speaks about the knots of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
In Sanskrit, they call Hridaya Granthi, the knots of the heart. That which binds us, which limits our freedom. And so the primary knot is the knot of ignorance. And when that knot is tied, then interestingly, you get the knot of, in Sanskrit, it's called karma. Again, I will translate it as greed. And I agree with you fully that greed is not simply the greed for the material, but there's the greed for power, the greed for fame, and pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And then greed leads to a greedful action. And therefore, this is what perpetuates the cycles of suffering. So greed is deeply problematized in Hindu tradition as it is in Buddhism, particularly because it is a false way to human flourishing and human fulfillment. This is the problem. In that sense, it is an illusory path to human fulfillment because can never be satiated. And the fullness that we seek, as far as the Advaita tradition goes, the fullness that we seek is not going to be attained by the fulfillment of desire after desire after desire. It's like a squirrel running on the wheel. It never stops. It is going to be satisfied by, if the problem is avidya, then there's a certain awakening, a certain self-understanding of one's own fullness, of the fullness of one's being.
Mm-hmm.
And from that place of fullness, we can live. We can enjoy the world. We can be compassionate. But the meaning of life, living fully in the world, requires an understanding, an awakening, a deep, and this, the knowledge that resolves ignorance, Bob, is not simply word knowledge.
Right.
It is a transformed understanding of self, of reality, from which, this world doesn't lose meaning, but gains new meaning.
Right.
And that is what I speak of as liberation.
Right.
Liberation for me, and in my interpretation of the Advaita tradition, is not freedom from the world, but a freedom in the world that comes from a transformed understanding of reality.
Right. And of course, the challenge is what you just said, is that just kind of explicit conceptual knowledge of the problem is not enough. We can all, upon reflection, acknowledge that, yeah, I guess based on experience, I can say that next promotion I'm so determined to get, or the next, candy bar I'm so determined to eat, or the next sexual conquest, or whatever, is not going to bring lasting happiness. And in fact, the gratification may well be followed by a kind of a hunger that's not that pleasant, that is all the more intense, even by virtue of the fact that you just satisfied the gratification. It's one thing to know that. But to be liberated from the repetitive quest, it requires more than just knowing it. And that's why, of course, there are all these contemplative disciplines, these meditative disciplines, and that's why, the term enlightenment, certainly in Buddhism and maybe in Hinduism, but is it applied to a state of being that people attain after extremely disciplined meditation over long periods of time that have allowed them to certainly, weaken their obedience to these human impulses, right? And that's why enlightenment is equated with liberation.
Yes.
But again, it is not enlightenment just in the book learning sense, and that's the whole challenge of the thing, right?
You're right. I think I would say that what you're saying applies both to our understanding of ignorance, avidya, as well as wisdom or jnana. That avidya is more than holding a certain notion of the world. It is also a way of being in the world. It completely overtakes your way of being. And in a similar way, liberation is not, being able to articulate the right words, but it's also a transformed way of being. Knowledge is a process. It's a discipline, as you said. It's a discipline of self transformation that is associated with a radically different understanding of reality. And I think this is articulated in the Upanishads by speaking of knowledge almost as a threefold process. You have to, if you are subject to avidya or ignorance, you have to hear something that is different, which is so hearing is the first step in transformation, and that's called, in Sanskrit, it's called sravana. And then you have to be, you have to live with that wisdom. You have to reflect on it. You have to churn it. It has to be constantly churned in your mind. It has to be a wisdom that contests habits of the mind and habits of the heart. So that process is called manana, deep reflection, internalization of wisdom. And the final, if it's a final process, it's assimilation, transformation. Upanishads speak of it as nirityasana. So those are I think that the threefold processes emphasize, as you quite rightly said, that the knowledge is liberating only when it goes in this very deep way into the heart of one's being and modes of thinking, feeling, and acting in the world.
And maybe I should note in passing, just in case it's not clear, that one of the connections between enlightenment and kind of ethical implications, which you're so concerned about, is, naturally enough, if to relieve your own suffering, you let go of the eternal quest for, you might say, selfishly gratifying things, that may lead you to almost naturally quit spending so much time pursuing your interests at the expense of other people's interests, and it tends to place you less in opposition to other people, and so it's a natural part of the path toward considering people's interests more fully, right?
Yes, because I think that, again, I want to say in different ways, Bob, that religion, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Christian tradition, offers us that we need most is an understanding of the meaning of human flourishing, what it means to flourish as a human being. And linking this with what you just said, I think that religious wisdom, religious teaching, religious transformation points to a way of human flourishing that is not dependent on the non-flourishing of others.
Right.
Yeah, I would put it in that way, that we can, human, or if you use the language of value, that it is an awakening to a value of being human that is not contingent on the devaluing of another, or not contingent on the competitive relationship with another. That I can truly be in a place where I see that I can rejoice in the flourishing of others, not and my own flourishing.
And this is part of enlightenment and part of liberation.
I would say it's very fundamental to the meaning of liberation, Bob. That I am invested in the flourishing of the other as I am invested in my own flourishing, because, as we said at the beginning, ultimately, my relationship with the other is not two.
Right.
To see oneself in the other is also to embrace the other's flourishing as one's own.
Right. Now, you said a number of times that you want to emphasize that you think of liberation as liberation in this world, not liberation from this world, not a complete escape in this world. And I gather you're getting back to some really ancient parts of spiritual practice in India, right? I mean, the whole contemplative practice, as I understand it, the emergence of contemplative practices in India is intermittently intertwined with this renunciation of the world and this idea that, look, the source of our suffering is it's just this world. It's the material world,
Yes.
and the idea is that you go and practice such austerities that you become completely indifferent to the blandishments of this world, and so you're just in another realm, and I gathered that, and of course the classic renunciant doesn't have much interaction with other people. They're not spending their time helping poor people or doing anything else. They're just off meditating, being alone, and no longer suffering. And so that's the part of the tradition that you're reacting against.
Yes, and that's been a prominent model, yes, in the Hindu tradition. I think you recognize it also in other traditions. Mm-hmm. The ascetic renunciation model, which, again, negativizes the body, the physical, the world, and sees, liberation as overcoming of, the world, as freedom from the world, mm-hmm. basically. And I am saying that there is another tradition, and again, I look at, say, the ideal of living liberation, which is so important in the Hindu tradition. In Sanskrit, we speak of Jivan Mukta, the living liberated, mm-hmm. in this world, which for me suggests a possibility that liberation is not liberation from the world, but liberation in the world. And while there certainly is a certain kind of renunciation, because something has to be given up. Something has to be given up. I mean, mm-hmm. this is something that is common to all of our religious traditions. But what has to be given up is not the world. The world itself is not the problem. The body is not the problem. What has to be given up is a certain way of seeing the world, a way of seeing oneself, mm-hmm. and seeing others. What we spoke of earlier as a way that is informed by ignorance. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I think liberation is not, for me, it's not complete unless it leads also, Bob, to an embrace of the world. Mm-hmm. An embrace of the world. There is a beautiful text, that opens one of the Upanishadic conversations. In Sanskrit, it's Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam Yat Kinchit Jagatyam Jagat, which basically affirms, one should wrap or see the entirety of reality as enfolded by, embraced by, held by this one. Mm-hmm. Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam Yat Kinchit Jagatyam Jagat. Tena tyaktena, knowing that and giving up, but the text comes back, enjoy the world. So it presents an interesting paradox, Bob, that we can really contemplate, which is that it says, enjoy by giving up. Mm-hmm. That, normally you think that these are polar opposites, that either you enjoy or you hold on to it. Mm-hmm. But here the text says, see the one in everything, give up and enjoy.
Right.
So it associates enjoyment of the world with an attitude also of non-possessiveness, which, in other words, enjoyment is heightened when we are free from greed.
Okay. And certainly that would be something that you would share with Buddhist thought, I think. So in closing, let me just touch on one actual specific social issue, because as I said, although we've dwelt on the philosophy in a kind of isolated space in a certain sense, we've talked about it at a somewhat generic level. The book has a lot of application to specific social issues like homophobia, anthropocentrism, patriarchy, and so on, and including the issue of caste
Yes.
in India, which as you know is an issue that's known to be somewhat distinctive to India. I guess my question is, I think it's everyone can kind of guess how you would come out on caste.
Yes.
You're not in favor of discrimination against men,
Right.
the untouchables or the so-called untouchables or anyone else.
Right.
But is it the case that that one thing you're fighting against is interpretations of Hindu texts that have in the past been in the service of the social system? I mean,
Yes.
it tends to happen in societies that whatever the power structure is, all kinds of rationales for the power structure are developed, and all kinds of interpretations of the religious text to support the power structure are developed. Has there been a specific kind of subordination of interpretation to the caste system, at least in some periods of Hindu thought, that you're reacting against?
Well, it's a very good point. I think that when we think of caste, I see caste as an example of where religion goes wrong. I mean, there are many ways in which we can think of, of how our religious traditions go wrong. Sometimes, for example, we seek to legitimize our own avidya or our own ignorance by appeals to religion. And I think that in the case of the caste system, part of the problem, as you said, is that there are certain texts that have been read and appropriated to justify this hierarchy, to justify, disempowering others and empowering certain groups. One such reading, I would say, Bob, among many, we can look at many texts, but I would make a more general point on this, which is, I think, has to do with the reading of the meaning of karma, which is something that we share with the Buddhist tradition. So many Hindu interpreters have read the doctrine of karma as in the following way, that the circumstance of your birth, the family in which you were born, is a consequence of your past action. And therefore, where you find yourself socially is a consequence of what you have done and the choices you have made. And therefore, you deserve to be there.
Right.
You deserve to be there. And the only way you can be free from there is by rebirth into different social circumstances. So in that way, an important teaching of the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition, which is the teaching on karma, is appropriated to justify, to legitimize a certain order, social order, that then becomes inflexible and not subject to change. I contest that reading of karma in this book as one example.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And as I said, there are many other examples of social application.
Yeah.
And the book is A Hindu Theology of Liberation. Not two is not one. I hope we've made sufficient sense of the subtitle by now. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time and both to write the book and to come on and talk about it. And maybe down the road later, when as I learn more about Advaita Vedanta and have more questions on it, maybe I'll try to talk you into coming on again and talking some more.
Thank you so much, Bob. I think you not only open up the conversation about this book, but if I may say, I think you open up the conversation in this way that led to many comparative kinds of explorations that I appreciate very much. And it would be wonderful, if we can have a panel of some kind.
Yeah.
And back to some of the issues that you raised that cuts across multiple religious traditions.
Yeah, no, that would be fun. And you were here at Union Theological Seminary, which is where I met you.
Yes.
And Union has kind of always been on the forefront of ecumenicism, in a sense. I mean, back when it was radical to have both Catholics and Protestants teaching at the same seminary, that was happening at Union. And I think now here, there's very much the sense that we're in a global age, and ecumenicism should be defined to include, all the world's spiritual traditions, and of course we're not alone in that. That's a common an increasingly common view that there needs to be dialogue among religions, and that maybe some of them have more in common than is appreciated. I think for that matter, there's an interest here in even talking to, bringing people into the conversation who didn't identify with any spiritual tradition, and
Yes,
maybe agnostic or even atheists, but still have philosophical views that
absolutely.
that may have a kind of a counterpart in religious thought. So, we are trying to advance that dialogue, and if you're not headed back here for a physical panel, maybe we should try to arrange an online panel.
It would be nice. And so what's you're finishing at Union at the end of this semester?
My future status, as it has so often been in my life, is unclear. So my current formal tenure ends in early fall, in a few months from now. But I don't know. I may maintain some kind of connection. So I will, in any event, be not far from New York.
Okay.
All right. So thanks.
Wonderful.
Thanks again so much. And
thank you, Bob, for this conversation, and thanks for inviting me to talk with you on your program. I really enjoyed this very much, and as always, questions always make one think deeper.
That's what they're for. Yeah. Well, I enjoyed it too, and have learned a lot, and have a lot to reflect on. So take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.